We're live. Excellent. Thank you, Bear. Thank you, everybody. Welcome back for our next sessions of workshops. Excuse me, macaron in my throat. This workshop is on Ministry of Transport proposals to strengthen total mobility. We've got Stuart, come to the table. Lynn, I think Claire might be, and then I've got Giles with me next to me. So straight over to you, Stuart, and kick us off.
Kia ora, councillors. So we're going to talk today around government consultation on strengthening total mobility scheme that's currently out in relation to our submission to that consultation. And we're also going to talk about the changes that have been made and announced by government around the subsidy levels for total mobility that come into place on the 1st of July, and some decisions that this council needs to make around our fare capping level that we've been tasked with reducing. So I'm going to cover the funding question first, and then get into the submissions for MOT. But just to give you a sense from a submissions point of view of where staff are feeling, you can see up on the slide the various questions that have been asked in the consultation process and whether staff view is we are supportive, or we have some questions, or we are concerned about what's been proposed, to give you a sense of where we're landing. But we'll come back to that when we get into the segment on the submissions.
Yeah.
Do you want questions through the presentation? Okay, clear.
Well, it's just helpful. Sorry if I might just get a bit of a clarity regarding the colour coding there, and I notice your feedback in here. On a scale of green to red, what are we looking like to interpret your orange type thing of degree of comfort? I mean, I'm fine with what you've got, but...
Sure. So no, good question. So green in our representation having green is that we're supportive of what's been proposed. Orange says we have some concerns and is suggesting an alternative. And red is we're not supportive of that change, and we give some reasons for it. Okay, so just to set the foundation for what we're going to talk about, we've made some statements here around supporting the overarching intent of the proposals, but we have some questions around a couple of things that I've mentioned, which we'll cover in more detail at the moment. If we just talk... Oh, what's going on here with this? It's not the order of events that I... No, okay. We'll pivot and slightly change our conversation and talk about the submissions proposal first, because that's how the slides have ended up. So proposal one is to set a clear purpose statement. And the purpose statement that was proposed is to provide subsidised mobility services to people who are unable to access public transport because of an impairment, to support them to live their lives. We're proposing that we have a slight change to that by including the word eligible people and removing the word disabled at the front of the sentence, because people are people. And yes, some people have some disabilities or impairments, but fundamentally they are people and they are unable to access public transport. So we think that's a better reflection of what the purpose statement should be. And including the word eligible recognises the fact that total mobility as a scheme does have eligibility criteria, and that the scheme applies to those that are eligible. So a nuanced change, but that's what we propose in our submission. Does anyone I'll have questions maybe on each one as we go. Yeah.
Have anybody got questions on this one? No?
Okay,
Oh,
great.
the green.
Proposal 2, make assessments fair and consistent. And there are 2 parts to this proposal. One part is to have more evidence available of a person's impairment, and the second part is to have periodic reassessments. What we do know from our experience with total mobility is our customers or our community with their impairments can change over time. Some people have temporary impairments, which results in them needing to use total mobility, and then those impairments are resolved and their eligibility would change. So having a periodic reassessment makes sense. Having more evidence, we think, makes sense. The question in our minds is, what is that evidence, and how does that evidence get assessed? By whom, and what competencies do the assessors have? At the moment, we rely on a range of agencies in our community to do assessments, folk like Blind Foundation, Aspire, who else, Lynn, is in our assessment?
Mainly Aspire.
Mainly Aspire, okay. And so they have staff that assess their clients as to their eligibility for using total mobility. If there are changes made to that assessment criteria that require evidence, such as medical evidence and things like that, we feel that there needs to be more training and consistency around that assessment process to make it fairer for everybody and consistent across the country. Proposal 3, this is one that we had some challenges with. It proposes to limit the number of trips that eligible customers can take on total mobility. And the options provided were everyone gets the same number of trips regardless of their circumstance. So, for example, you're allowed to take 10 trips a month or 100 trips a month or whatever. And option B was to be more nuanced and have trips based on need or circumstance. So some people have more impairments than others. They may need to visit support networks more frequently. Some people are working and therefore they need to take trips to work to support entities as well. And of course, the underlying principle of total mobility is that folk can live their lives and engage with society from an economic and social perspective. So there are those trips as well. Our feeling is that limiting trips doesn't seem to align with the spirit and the intent of this scheme. We don't limit trips on public transport. You can take as many trips as you like. In fact, we encourage you to take as many trips as you like, and we cap your cost to incentivise that. So our feeling is it seems inequitable that folk who can't use public transport, and therefore this service is there to catch those people, would be limited in how they engage with society. If we consider the increased eligibility testing and the periodic testing, that in itself will help us to focus on those who need this service most, and will likely have an impact on the volume of trips in total that are taken. So we have some concerns about trip limits. However, if government were to decide to go down this road, we feel that the trip limit settings should be set relatively high. And the reason we say that is when we look at the profile of our existing community base that uses this service, you can see at the bottom there, 75% of our customers take fewer than 50 trips per year. And that averages out at just under 2 a week. That doesn't seem to be onerous to me, or to us as staff. 90% of our customers take fewer than 160 trips per year. Again, it's a very low number. So we want to encourage communities to engage with society, both economically and socially, and by limiting their ability to do so seems counterintuitive. If the trip limits were to be applied based on the analysis of our current usage profiles you can see on the right-hand side a range of limits and what that would mean in terms of customers impacted. So we know that a very small percentage of our customers do a lot of travel, and typically those folk are working, and so they use total mobility to get to and from work. They use total mobility to access social opportunities. They use total mobility to access their support networks, medical, etc. So this is why we feel that any trip limit would need to be set relatively high. Any questions on that?
Clear.
So the reason I asked before around the colour coding was that this was the one that I've sort of got highlighted, and particularly in your draft. I'm just wondering, I mean, I support option 3, and I support your comments about making sure that the limit's realistic for people, so it's relatively high. But I just wonder if you could look at how you've got them ordered and written in your draft proposal at this stage, just to make it quite clear that we prefer 3A with the provisos that you've just talked about. So if you could do that. I also really appreciate, and I'm not quite sure how much opportunity we get, especially since we heard the public deputation last week from Aspire around the improving of administration and administration integrity. Quite concerning what we were sort of hearing there. So whether we could actually perhaps expand out that in part of this as well. No question, sorry.
Okay, Ian?
Well, Stuart, you touched on it when you said these people, people who require total mobility services, have no other options, effectively. And it seems to me that if we're providing a social service, which we are in this case, funded by central government, we should be prioritising how we value the social services we're providing through our PT offering. And it would seem to me that people who rely on total mobility would score a hell of a lot higher than university students who we subsidise quite substantially on our public transport system, as an example. And so I guess my question really is that if we were to use money we've already put aside for one level of subsidy to consumers, could we repurpose that to, if the government is intent on restricting access to total mobility, can we put our other ratepayer money, repurpose it, which we're using to subsidise other demographics, into helping out total mobility people?
There's a couple of parts to that question. So at a macro level, the intent behind these changes, both from a funding perspective that have been announced and these proposals, is to better manage the demand and therefore the public subsidy that's applied. So government are particularly interested in reducing the burden on taxpayer and the burden on the ratepayer. That's a fundamental principle. Secondly, at a macro level, as you're all aware, we have coming in the future restrictions on the level of rating that we can undertake through rate capping. So there is no rule or requirement that I'm aware of that would prevent a council from contributing more to a total mobility subsidy, as long as it remained the council's total rates stays within its capping. So repurposing existing cost funding seems like that would be possible. Total mobility is not incorporated into the private revenue calculations, so it does not feature in that aspect for us. So therefore, if council wanted to invest more into total mobility, it would not have a negative impact on that measure that we have for public transport. So changing of allocation of funding would be possible.
Ashley?
Can I just make a comment that perhaps it's something that Joe's Core Service Committee might take up, that discussion, the discussion I've just raised.
Ashley?
And this may not be our place. It may be more the gentleman from Aspire we heard last week. But you said that the people who are using lots of trips are generally going to work. Has there been any analysis done of what the effect on their work would be if we limited those number of trips? For example, would some have to give up work? Would some have to go part-time? And what would be the economic cost of that? Has any analysis of that been done?
No, we don't have that information to analyse in our data sets.
John? Fulmer?
I go back to Councillor Mackenzie's question. If the subsidy is reduced and council decides that they would, as part of their social obligation to disadvantaged communities, do we have an estimate on what that would cost the council?
Perhaps we can come to that when we go through the funding question. Yeah.
Right, move to the next one.
Okay, so proposal number 4 is intended to encourage more investment in wheelchair accessible assets to enable more wheelchair accessible trips, and we clearly support this initiative. What we do know is that the allocation of grant funding is not consistent across the country, and so we feel that should be standardised to make it easier for potential investors and operators to have a consistent approach to this. At the moment, the system is based on supply and demand. So if an operator sees there is an opportunity to have a going concern from a business point of view by having a wheelchair accessible vehicle, then they would invest in that vehicle. We have had situations in the past where there wasn't enough vehicles in Greater Christchurch to service the demand. We also know that drivers of wheelchair accessible vehicles for total mobility need specific skills, both in terms of how to manage the vehicle, how to manage the hoist, how to engage with and support customers who need that service. So ensuring there is a consistent level of training, I think, is important as well. Lastly, when we talk about that supply and demand aspect, we have this challenge, not just in Canterbury, but nationally. On one hand, there is a cohort in our community that needs wheelchair accessible vehicles. On the other hand, there is a cohort in the community that would rather travel in a taxi vehicle rather than a wheelchair vehicle. So as an owner-driver of a wheelchair accessible vehicle, your market is somewhat constrained. And that is a challenge for these folk making a business out of this. And as we've said in previous sessions, it's important that these folk make money because otherwise the service wouldn't exist. So we have to recognise that they need to be able to run a successful business. And so we feel that more incentives need to be provided to entities that are providing wheelchair accessible vehicles to make it viable for them to do so. The current model is perhaps not enabling of that.
I think you're good.
Okay. Proposal 5 is to allow new providers, more specifically referencing rideshare services and hail and ride services such as Uber. Recently, we retested the market in Canterbury for total mobility providers, and we had a very strong response. In fact, I think we have circa 17 that are being signed up at the moment for Greater Christchurch. Our view is that in our community, there is sufficient operators available, the wheelchair aspect being an exception. That doesn't require us to introduce the idea of an operator such as Uber. Some of the challenges we see with that is we are talking about quite vulnerable members of our community. And we know and we see in the behaviour of how they consume this service, they like to trust and know the people who drive them. They build a relationship with drivers who understand their needs and who have a level of care that is associated with what they're looking for. So driver training and driver capability is very, very important for total mobility customers. As we said earlier, we would expect consistent driver training and qualifications nationally. The other thing about total mobility is we contract organisations to provide the service, and those organisations facilitate drivers. Whereas Uber is an owner-operator, one-to-one arrangement, and so we would have many, many contracts with individuals, which creates an administrative burden for us. It creates more uncertainty for the customer, and we just don't feel that it would deliver the outcomes that our customer base is looking for. One of the other aspects that were raised in this proposal was encouraging on-demand type models for use for total mobility. As you know, we have on-demand in Timaru, and we trialled a total mobility service with that product. It was a $5 fee for a driveway-to-driveway service. As you know, My Way is not a drive; it's a corner-to-corner based service. It didn't get very strong uptake. Notwithstanding that, we do think it's a good idea because our on-demand vehicles in Timaru are fully wheelchair capable, and so it's potentially a question of education and encouragement to utilise that service. We do need to take account of the fact that in places like Timaru, Ashburton, the taxi services down there have a very small population base that they serve. And so again, to run a successful taxi operation, they rely on total mobility customers as a significant proportion of their business. So we need to balance, well, we have a need to provide a transport solution, but the community also has a need for a successful taxi service. So if we were to undermine that, that could be a problem.
Just on that, you're talking about the drivers, the relationship piece there. Is there not a risk in that respect where you get driver familiarity with the customer and the potential for, I'm not even going to repeat it, but what we heard the other week? Is that a risk that's been taken into that thinking?
Yes. As I was saying earlier, I feel that we have to, as an organisation facilitating this service such as this, the purpose it exists is to support vulnerable members of our community who otherwise have challenges engaging with society. Those folk have particular needs, and one of those needs is to feel safe, to feel supported. And how they achieve that is by having a relationship with one or a number of drivers who they trust. So trust is very important. So on one hand, you could say, well, yes, we don't want that because it creates the opportunity for inappropriate behaviours from a transaction point of view. That is true. But is that outweighed by the benefit to the individual of engaging with society and feeling safe to do so? Mm. So I feel that from an organisational point of view, investing more time in compliance and auditing would be a better way to ensure that the rules are being followed, while still supporting and enabling these folk to consume the service the way they want to achieve the outcomes from an engagement point of view.
And I just wanted to tease out a little bit the provide a more value for money service outcome for the customers and funders. That's around the on-demand. You were talking about the more rural areas, but in certain zones within the city, we know where uptake is. I think we've had a briefing before about where we're seeing the biggest uptake of total mobility. Do you think it would work in some of those zones where we do have those higher areas of uptake, so certain suburbs to certain locations and providing services that way?
Yeah, I think this might lead nicely into Proposal 6 as,
Oh, yeah.
as part of answering that question. So Proposal 6 was to provide a national public transport discount for total mobility customers. And as Council knows, we already do that. We have a concession that we 100% fund ourselves for total mobility customers and their support person to use total mobility. And we have seen an uptake of that service. Now, while it's modest compared to patronage in general, it is a signal that there are members of our total mobility community who are willing to engage with public transport if we enable that in more ways. And so having potentially on-demand services in Greater Christchurch gives those customers more choice and more freedom, in fact, to engage in their community activities.
Just want to say hello to IRD. I think I hear that there's some people from IRD watching right now, so hello to you guys who do use this service. So for people getting into and coming into from work, it's very important. Anyway, just needed to say that. Tax man, keep the tax people happy.
Okay, so that's should be the end of the. Yeah, I don't understand what's happened to our slides.
Yeah,
Go back.
go back perhaps. Might be in the front.
Oh,
There
okay.
you go.
Right, yeah.
Back to front.
It's better.
Okay. Okay. So we'll move on to the money talk.
Sorry, did I just said I think I saw a couple of questions just on those proposal part. Was that something that you wanted to? Okay, we'll talk money then. Let's go. Oh, yep.
So, staff, could you just look at point 2 on your draft, and particularly the last sentence of point 2? I think it might belong to somewhere else. Talks about the council's submission on the land use proposals.
Yes, we did pick that up yesterday after we sent you. It should say the total mobility proposals. Thank you.
Joys of templating.
Andrea?
I just did the numbers on this, and so it's about 17,000 people in Canterbury in a wheelchair. That's what I looked it up. So 24% are disabled, but 12% is mobility disabled, which comes to about 17,000 people in Canterbury, which would mean about 1,000 people each for us if we were representing. And I do know quite a few people in wheelchairs, and like, life is much harder when you're in a wheelchair. Much. So, yeah, I think it's a very valuable thing. Again, it's probably not one of our jobs, but it's I think it's important that it's part of the package of moving people around.
Joe?
Could you just set out kind of like where the scheme is at, like with other providers like Uber, like other transport options?
So, total mobility customers, Uber is not a eligible operator, so they're not because of all the reasons we've just talked about. So, in terms of folk who have transport mobility or access issues, just to think about what you just said before, Councillor Davis. If we think back to when total mobility was created, back in the 80s, I think it was, Len. And at that time, we didn't have low-floor buses. We didn't have kneeling buses. We didn't have buses with ramps. We didn't have wider corridors in the vehicles. And so you simply couldn't take public transport if you were in a wheelchair or if you had a mobility issue. You know, the steps were high, etc., etc. And that's why total mobility got created. Since then, there has been significant changes to the fleet profiles. The road requirements for urban buses has been brought into place, and that requires all public transport vehicles to be low floor, to be kneeling, to have a ramp, and to have the space for wheelchair customers. So there's been a significant change in the fleet profile since total mobility was created. And this will be one of the reasons that Ministry of Transport is going through this process at the moment, because some of those barriers that did exist when total mobility was created don't exist now. And so there is possibly a view that some of our total mobility customers don't need total mobility anymore because the public transport fleet has accommodated those challenges. In terms of their choices, well, if they're able to use public transport, either themselves or with a helper, we have that facility now. We have total mobility, as I said, with 17 different operators in Greater Christchurch, in Ashburton, in Timaru, in Waimate. People can also take taxis. We know that some of our total mobility customers can sometimes use public transport, and they do sometimes use public transport. I'll just remind you of the 5 criteria at the moment that are in place. Can I walk to the bus stop? Can I physically get on the bus? Can I pay and engage with the driver? Can I physically get off the bus? Can I walk, or can I travel to my destination? So if you can't do any one of those things, then at the moment you're eligible for a total mobility card. That's it.
So MIT aren't reviewing like possible, or like Uber or other options. They're not reviewing that they could fit that in, or.
Oh, that was one of the proposals, that they become a part of the eligible service provider suite. And in our response, in case of Waitaha Canterbury, we didn't see there was a need for that. And we felt that introduced some risks for the cohort that use the service that will be difficult for us to manage.
Excellent. Okay, we'll move into the...
And also,
did you
like
have
you
something
said,
you wanted to say, Andrea?
Uber wouldn't be the same relationship. It might be the same relationship you have with your driver of the van, but it probably wouldn't be the same relationship.
Well, it could be, but there's really no one behind the driver. I think that's the essence that we've learned over the years with how Uber functions. Look, this next conversation, as I said, is a money conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so because it's a money conversation, it's a bit dispassionate. And I just wanted to make that point because we've talked a lot about vulnerable people, and that's very important. And this conversation is about dollars and cents. Okay. Let's go past that. We've talked about that. So we've done quite a lot of analysis of our current usage profile to help us understand how we might respond to the consultation and also understand what the implications will be from the funding changes. And at a very high level, we know that the subsidy rate of 75% is the dominant driver of financial impact for customers and for us, because that drives more trips. We also know that if we will have to reduce our fare threshold. Those reductions provide a much smaller level of saving in investment than the subsidy rate does. And I'll talk about that a bit more. The customer impact of changes in these subsidy rates are concentrated on the higher fare trips and remain very modest on average. That goes back to the level of usage that I talked about earlier. There's a small cohort of customers who use total mobility a lot, and they will be significantly impacted by this. The vast majority of customers will have some or none impact on them. I won't worry about that last point. So just to give you a sense of where we're at right now, the bar tells you the level of the trip usage or consumption over time compared to pre-COVID, when the subsidy level changed. And what you can see is the consumption has grown every year since it was changed to 75%. The lines represent the cost of the service, and you can see every year since the change, it has gone up. and council have had to adjust our rates to accommodate that increased demand. If we look at the growth rate on the left-hand side, the orange line shows you the rate of growth in trips since the subsidy was changed. So when it got changed from 50% to 75%, in that first year we had 36% growth in trips, and then 20, so I can't quite read it from here, etc. And then the blue line shows you the end increase on the previous year. So what we can see is the growth is slowing. So if we did nothing, eventually we would get to an equilibrium of affordability versus trips. And we'll come back to this analysis later, because we're using this analysis to understand the implications of price change. On the right-hand side, you can see the average subsidy per trip trend since the subsidy rates were changed, and as we know, they have gone up significantly to $23 circa per trip subsidy on average. If we look at the rates impact specifically, again, it mirrors the total cost issue. Rates consumption has increased and continues to increase as trips go up, and council have had a number of conversations about this in the last 12 to 18 months. What we've done is spent some time analysing behaviour to look at how the total mobility service is consumed by customers. And what this chart endeavours to represent is how many trips per year people make. And what you can see is the vast majority of customers do very few trips on a yearly basis. That's why the line is very steep at the left-hand end, and then starts to taper off around the 50, 60 trips a year mark. And then there's this really long tail right out to, I can't even read that number, 1,382 trips, which is probably an outlier in the data. But what this tells you is there's very few people that do a lot of travel and total mobility. But when those people do many trips. And you can see down the bottom there, the bullets there, approximately 1 to 2% of customers take trips above 400 per year. And to put that in context, for myself, I travel to work most days. 1 day a week I work from home, so I don't travel. So 4 days a week, that's 8 trips a day. You take that over a year, I quickly get to 400 trips, and then I need to go to the doctor, the chemist, go shopping, buy my food, engage with some friends. So a person generally in the community would do way more than 400 trips a year. But our total mobility cohort is doing significantly less than that. If we look at the age demographic, circa 77% of them are over 65, so they're not working. Most of them won't be working. So that's probably impacting the consumption profile. So it's useful to understand the usage footprint when we start talking about capping and pricing, etc. So what has the government done? They've made some decisions around changing the funding. The fare subsidy level will reduce from the current 75% to 65% on 1 July. NZTA and the government, or NZTA, are working with us to meet an expectation set by government that we reduce our fare caps by approximately 10%. Now that word has been specifically used in the government statements because they are looking for, in some cases, more than 10% and potentially in some cases less than 10%. But really what they want is 10%. A reduction in capping. And the intention behind this is to reduce the cost to the Crown, who is funding that 75% extra step, and also a reduction in the rates for the local authorities. And they were going to use the money saved to help us deal and offset with the additional costs that we've been carrying this fiscal year because of the 75% subsidy. So there's a bit of a carrot in there for councils. On the policy side, We've talked about what those things are, so I won't go into that too much further. So let's really get into the nitty-gritty. So pre-COVID, total mobility subsidy was 50% and has been at that rate for a long, long time. In April 2023, the government increased the subsidy to 75%. And the reason they did that was because they also had implemented a 50% subsidy for public transport users to encourage people to get back on the bus following the lockdowns. And it was evident that that was inequitable for the total mobility cohort, who are also public transport users or customers in the wider scheme, and so the 75% subsidy was introduced, taking it from 50 to 75. In April 2024, the 50% subsidy for public transport was removed, but the 75% subsidy for total mobility remained. And now government is wanting to reduce that down to 65% and also reduce the fare cap threshold, which is currently $70 in Canterbury. So that gives us some historical context. So now if we look at what that means, the bottom, there's a lot of stuff on the slide and I'll just spend some time talking about it. The bottom left table is intended to give you an insight into how the subsidy is funded and by whom. So there are three parties. There's the Crown, there is NZTA, and their money comes from the National Land Transport Fund, and then there is public transport authorities. So when the fare subsidy was 50%, if a fare was $50, the customer paid half of it. They paid $25. And then the Crown paid nothing because they weren't contributing at that time. And the remaining 50% was split between NZTA and the public transport authorities on a 60-40 basis. We paid 40%, NZTA paid 60%. When the subsidy changed to 75%, the customer only pays 25% of the fare now, $12.50. The remaining 75% is split as follows. The 25% from 50 to 75 is funded by the Crown. So that step from 50% to 75% in 2023 was 100% funded by the Crown. Not out of the National Land Transport Fund, out of Crown funding buckets. Which meant the remaining 50% that was left continued to be funded through NZTA National Land Transport Fund and through Public Transport Authority rates at a 60-40 split. Why that's important is you can see that what we contribute to the cost of a trip stayed the same. We paid $10, NZTA paid $15, and the Crown paid $25. So when the subsidy reduces from 75 to 65%, at a base level, that has no impact on our cost footprint because that reduction is wholly returned to the Crown. So we can ask the question, okay, well, how's it going to reduce rates? That doesn't make much sense. Well, the way it's intended to reduce our rating is that will attenuate consumption, and therefore less trips will occur and our contribution will reduce on that basis. So we did some work to understand, well, what might that look like? And you recall the graph that showed the growth in usage, the orange line going up and the blue line slowly coming down. So it started at 36% and then over 3 years, 4 years, it's down to 14%. So we did some modelling based on the levels of trip attenuation that might occur because of this pricing change. Normally when you're talking about consumption and paying for products or services, there's a thing called elasticity. And that tends to calculate the response of the consumer to price increases and price decreases. What's important to understand is elasticity is never even. So if the price goes down, you have one response, and if the price goes up, you don't have the same response. You have a different level of response. So we've modelled 5 different scenarios, i.e. there's no change in trips. There is a 5% reduction of 10 through to 30%. So based on that original increase in trips, we are putting our pin on a potential 20% reduction in trips. It's not a given. It could be less, it could be more. We sort of that's where we're putting our pin. That would save ECAN. Well, it would reduce our contribution by circa $812,000 based on this financial year's numbers.
Is this just based on cost, or is it also those other eligibility criteria that you?
Just on cost.
Just on cost. Okay.
Just on cost. So we just analysed our current usage rates and profiles and applied this to that because we don't know what the eligibility changes are.
Yeah.
So you get a sense of the impact to us simply based on a reduction in trips from 65 to 75. So when we get into the fare capping area, it's a little bit more complicated. I apologise for the complexity of this slide, but hopefully I'll be able to explain it to you. So at the moment, our cap is $70, and there's 83,900 and something trips a year that trip that threshold. That's out of circa 500 and something thousand trips. So 6.5% of customers trip over that threshold. If we were to reduce our fare cap by 5%, 5% of customers would now trip over that threshold. If we were to reduce our fare cap by 10% to $63, a further 2.6% of trips would trip over. So our decision to reduce our capping, for example, by 10% would impact 7.8% of existing customers. The rest would see no impact to that capping change. So that's what that left-hand story is trying to articulate to you. The right-hand table gives you a sense of the impact to the customer of these two things coming together. So the reduction from 75 to 65% plus the reduction in capping by 5, 10 or 15%. And so you can see the different scenarios we've modelled, how the threshold for the price cap would change, what the customer would pay, and what level of increase that would mean to them if they tripped over the cap threshold. And that's an important point. So this really only applies to that cohort that trips over the cap threshold. If you don't trip over the cap threshold, then you're not going to see this level of change. It averages around $3 a trip otherwise. So then we've joined those two things together to calculate or estimate what the impact on Environment or Canterbury Regional Council's rating contribution would be. So on the left-hand side going down, we've got the different combinations of subsidy reduction and capping, 5, 10, 15% choices. And you can see the average fare impact there. And on the right-hand side of the table, the different trip reduction scenarios that might occur. And we've highlighted the green box, which we've put our pin on as the sort of sweet spot, if you like, of a 10% reduction in capping and likely a 20% reduction in trips. Results in a circa $1.2 million, $1.28 million reduction in contributions from Canterbury Regional Council. And how that's made up, you can see that at the bottom. Currently, we're forecast to spend just over $4 million of rating funding this fiscal year. If we take off the maximum subsidy amount, or if we 75 to 65, we saw that in the table before, $812,000. If we choose the 10% capping and the 20% reduction of trips, we add another $470,000, and we get to the 1.2. That's how it's calculated. I'll stop there for a moment because there's a lot of information there.
I'd just like to say staff have done a great job with the tables. I think they're quite easy, quite clearly to understand. I mean, it didn't take me very long to pick up what you were trying to explain. So, and thank you for the careful explanations.
Joe, do you have something?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, pretty much behind all of the positions around the proposals. I mean, the one I'm just a bit uncertain about is 5, just because I do kind of just like wonder why we wouldn't explore allowing new people in. We know people use Uber because it's like 20 to 40% cheaper than private taxis. So I don't see why we wouldn't give people that choice or support that choice being made available. So I guess in the process from here until the submission goes in, I'll formulate some thinking about that.
Have we got any other slides? Oh, that's it, is it? Oh, excellent. Okay, so I'll go to questions. We've got 10 minutes. So Councillor Faulkner and then Councillor Gerard.
Just going back to the eligibility criteria, and there seems to be a push to tighten that up. Is there any indication on what impact that would have? I know you said that it hasn't been set yet, but is there a sort of front of mind piece?
I think it really comes down to the nature of the criteria. One would imagine the criteria will be tightened by some level. What's useful to understand in the transport mobility space is there are several different avenues for people depending on their situation. So I might fall off my mountain bike in the weekend and break my leg.
Please don't.
And if I won't be able to drive. On one hand, I could be eligible for total mobility in that instance because it'd be difficult for me to walk to a bus stop and ride the bus because I do ride the bus. So I could apply for a total mobility card and very likely get one and use that service. And when my leg is repaired, there's no mechanism for me to give that back and I could just keep using it. Alternatively, because I fell off my mountain bike and broke my leg, I'm eligible for ACC. And ACC provide transport assistance funding. So one could argue, well, why aren't I using that rather than total mobility? So that could be, for example, a criteria. There are other transport options depending on your situation as well, outside total mobility. So it could be that government chooses to narrow the band so that they aren't overlapping. In terms of the impact on the customer base, I do believe it will reduce the number of customers we carry. We know in the case of Greater Wellington, they a few years ago brought their assessments in-house rather than outsourcing it, and that did attenuate their customer base by applying a different approach to eligibility testing. And that may be something that we want to consider, but we need to put some thought into that. So it really depends on what comes out of it, but its intent is to reduce the number of eligible customers.
Nick Moody.
Thank you. Great presentation as always. Yep, I'm supportive of the submission. It looks really good to me. My question is just around timing and decisions. I can see in the paper that there's a March decision coming up, decision on total mobility capping threshold change, March council meeting. And I remember the guy who presented last time from Aspire, I asked what's his recommendation, and he said, well, there's big changes coming from central government, around July. My recommendation would be wait to find out what they're going to do before you make your changes at the local government level to avoid the potential double whammy. So can we do that? Are we doing that? What would be the pros and cons of doing that?
So we are required to change our capping by 1 July. That is a government's mandate that's been given to us, so we can't wait until 1 July. In order to change capping across the motu, our service provider needs to reconfigure their system that the taxi companies and the operators use to record transactions and therefore claim their subsidy. And they need to know what our new capping threshold is going to be, as they need to know from every other PTA around the country, so they can reconfigure their system to accommodate by 1 July. So we really don't have any option to do that by then. I think what we've learnt from doing this work and doing the deep dive into the usage profiles, and as you've seen in some of the information that I showed up there, the vast majority of people will be minimally impacted by these changes because their consumption rate is already very low and below, and in many cases below the capping threshold as it stands. And as we showed in this table, if we reduce our capping by 10%, 7.8% of our existing customers will be impacted by that. So, okay, that's 7.8% of our existing customers will likely need to pay more to use total mobility. But the flip side is the vast majority, 85% of our customers won't be. So I think we need to be careful around asserting certain things around customer impact. Some customers will be impacted, and some way more than others because they use total mobility a lot.
Yeah, look, you're the expert. I'm just asking the questions. I didn't feel that your response really addressed my questions, which were but I can infer. So I said, "Are we waiting?" You said, "No, we can't wait by law. We need to make a decision in the same month as the central government announcement." I mean, March. How come it's March? Closer to July, we'll have a better idea of what's coming out of central government. Then we could make a more informed decision. Why does it need to be in March rather than in, say, June? Yeah.
Because our service provider requires the information from us to change their system. I think it's also important to recognise the language from central government. So they've signalled an expectation that we reduce our capping by approximately 10%. What we know is from our conversation with the NZTA, who've been tasked with working with us around that, their advice to us is that we have to have a very, very strong rationale for doing less than 10%. So that's why we've put our pin on 10%, and doing the analysis suggests to us that it's a good middle ground in terms of impact to the community, impact to the ratepayer, aligning and achieving the government's expectations.
Councillor Gerard.
Yeah, Chair. My camera on. Maybe. There we go. Yes. So, yeah, thank you so much for this presentation and the empathy demonstrated, and for what is really health and disability issues, and thank you too for the easy to understand presentation in the graphs. So a couple of questions. I think we're relying on a decrease in use, but with the ageing population, will that actually happen? Will we actually have an increase? And secondly, is where have you been having discussions with ACC and WINS and the workplaces for these high use 7.8% current users? Is there other ways that they can be supported?
That's a very good question. And if I take some liberties here and broaden that question a little bit, you could ask the question, and Councillor McKenzie kind of alluded to it earlier, that we're providing a social service. You could interpret total mobility as a social service rather than a transport service. And so you could reasonably ask the question, well, why is transport funding this rather than Ministry of Health or Ministry of Social Services, etc.? And that's a very good question to ask. However, that's not the question that government is asking of us. And so they have put it fairly and squarely in the transport space. So we could, for example, include in our submission that question, just to say, hey, you might want to think about this, but it's not being consulted on, and so at the moment there's no room for that conversation.
Right, I'm going to have to wrap it up with Councillor Campbell.
I have a family member who uses total mobility, and they became eligible after a medical event, not an accident, a medical event. And they still use it occasionally, are able to drive sometimes. When they're not feeling well, they use total mobility. My question, you talked about having an accident and that being also eligible for ACC funding. My question is whether I know that we're not going to get to decide eligibility or how that could be moderated, but whether the suggestion that there could be a short-term eligibility after medical events, perhaps for 6 months, perhaps for a year, and then, if necessary, renewed, but the default being it isn't. Because I think, just from the experience of my family member, they could actually kind of get by with the rest of us without total mobility and the driving they can do. It definitely makes their life easier, but they could get by. So I'm just contemplating what you said about the there's no end date, and whether we could suggest a limited medical event where there then has to be a reassessment or they lose it. That's just a possibility.
Certainly we can include something around that when we're talking to the question of review, because one of the proposals is to have a revalidation frequency, and we could include that in that, our response to that around different periods of time for revalidation. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the presentation. We're going to move on. I do come back. I'm just curious about how the outsourcing is funding. Is it funded by the service, or is it the rates funded?
So in terms of the assessment for eligibility at the moment, we fund the time taken by third parties to do that assessment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Appreciate that. So look forward to that coming back to us. Next up, we've got a briefing on the CWMS, also local leadership groups. Cam, do you want to come up and just introduce us? This was come out of councillors had a few questions about where we are at with local leadership groups in the context of CWMS and the wider stuff that we're doing. So this is a good opportunity just to bring that back to us and say where we are at now and where we're going.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, councillors. Before I get started, I'd just like to introduce Martin Espig, who's sitting to my right. Martin is a Principal Strategy Advisor in the strategy space in one of my teams, and he's really been kind of behind the scenes driving a lot of this work forward, which is important work, but it's not always easy. This is Martin. So we have a number of slides to work through today. But just quickly, this is an update on where we're at with local leadership groups. We talked to this work briefly with you in November of last year to give you an overview of it, of where it's at. But I understand there'll be kind of a number of questions around how it's progressing. I don't want to dive into the history too much, but we do have this slide here. And so local leadership groups very much have come out of the Canterbury Mayoral Forum and particularly its work around the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. So the CWMS, as you often hear it referred to, was adopted by the Mayoral Forum in 2009, and it's provided a collaborative framework to manage Canterbury's water, and it's been a really kind of quite a key driving force behind a lot of the work that this organisation's taken, along with territorial authorities across Canterbury and the community. And I know a number of you have been involved in zone committees in the past. And so 10 zone committees were created and a regional committee from 2010 onwards. Really focused on engaging community, developing solutions to local water issues, and supporting implementation of the strategy. In 2024, the Mayoral Forum initiated a review of zone committees to assess the ongoing role of those in supporting the CWMS. And this came against the backdrop of changing national circumstances. If you think about new national policy statements for freshwater management, there was increasing focus on kind of three waters and local water done well. But also the changing role and nature of the zone committees had a real focus on supporting regional plan making over the 2010s, and I know a lot of you are very aware of that. And then we're asked to step into some implementation space, but that started to creak a little bit. And so we saw some of that creaking with the Hurunui Waiā Uwha Zone Committee being disestablished in 2021. And then so there were ongoing questions about the role of these groups, and so that's when the Mayoral Forum initiated a review of the zone committees. And so this review, it was very in-depth, and Martin was a key player here, involved engagement with council, mayors, zone committees, and Papatipu Runanga. There's about a 100-page report of analysis on this that's publicly available, and we can kind of make that available if you haven't seen it. But it was a very in-depth review. So following that review, in May last year, the Mayoral Forum agreed to the establishment of local leadership groups. And part of this was recognising that while zone committees still worked well in some places, it wasn't fit for purpose across the whole of Canterbury. And so they looked to identify a new approach that better reflected kind of where we are now. But central to that was that ongoing collaboration between parties was critical, and so there's absolutely no stepping away from that. Now, there are currently 8 groups being set up across Canterbury, and I'll talk to these groups on the map following this page shortly. So the Mayoral Forum agreed that these groups consist of regional councils, local mayors, councillors, Papatipu Runanga, and community representatives where they are sought, and we're starting to see that through across a number of these groups. The initial focus of our work that we've been leading on behalf of the Mayoral Forum has been focused on refining boundaries for these groups, and there has been some shifts depending on what works best locally, confirming membership of these groups, along with structure, whether these groups should be a joint committee or they should move into a slightly kind of less formal arrangement, but also discussing core purpose and scope, and that's what we want to talk to while we're here today as well. Because while core purpose was talked about by the Mayoral Forum, we're really starting to see that take shape locally. And so that's what we want to start to talk to today about what we're hearing through these establishment hui. So these are the 8 groups that are being established at the moment. And so obviously moving from the north, Kaikoura, right down south to Waitaki Waihao. And so you'll see all the numbers there. There are a couple of blanked out spaces, and that's where the approach hasn't quite yet been confirmed yet. And that's where we still need to get the key parties in the room. One is around the Rakaia. The councils are proposing that the Rakaia act as the kind of the boundary between the Ashburton and the Selwyn Waihora. We just need to pick that conversation up with Runanga as well. And also near the word Christchurch there, this is the approach to the ihutai. Once again, we just need to get the key parties in the room and assess how what the approach is to the ihutai and whether it should sit by itself or should sit with Christchurch or should sit with the Waimakariri Rakahuri to the north. And so there's obviously this moves from 10 water zones, and so we're down to 8. We might be back up to 9, but we will see how the conversations evolve. Some of these look very similar to the CWMS water zones. Others look a little bit different, particularly if you look down south to number 8. there's been a proposal to join the lower and the upper Waitaki, and so that's why we're seeing a bigger local leadership group coverage area there. So we've been working through purpose and scope with these groups, and while there were some high kind of level words that started off the purpose of these groups, we're really starting to see purpose take shape, and we're hearing this from a number of groups. But really, if we're kind of distilling it, it's the aim of these advisory groups is to provide collaborative and strategic leadership that fosters shared understanding and cooperation on local catchment management issues. Supports community-driven action that delivers towards CWMS targets, and this has been one of the key themes around supporting the good, the huge amount of community action that's already being undertaken. Not necessarily act as governance over top of that, but just making sure those communities can continue to deliver their good work. And what's also come up has supporting transition to new resource management and local government settings. While that's still a little bit hasn't taken too much shape, the groups have certainly discussed the importance of coming together while this transition through the transition over the next year or two. And so that's what we're starting to see these groups really focus on. But ultimately, all of them are talking about outcomes and how we deliver kind of improved outcomes, and that's particularly thinking about the CWMS. And so some of those outcomes, along with your CWMS kind of targets, the groups have been very keen on ensuring we build on the existing effort or the effort that was made by zone committees in the community. That includes both on-the-ground work, but it also includes a bunch of analysis that has been undertaken, and some of those key documents are zone implementation plans and or programs and addendums, iwi management plans for etc. There's a whole bunch of information out there that these groups can kind of lean on and draw from when they're thinking about what actions need to be undertaken at place. Progressing local issues that contribute to CWMS targets, increasing coordination and alignment across parties. It's been often noted that there just needs to be kind of shared understanding between parties, and I know this came up at the Te Pātika Whakaropua meeting that we had on Monday this week. And there's also been conversation around widening scope over time. And so this, they've talked about biodiversity, which is very much tied into the CWMS, but also whether or not biosecurity discussions should take place.
What was the meeting that you had earlier this week? Could you...
Banks Peninsula, Littleton Harbour, yeah, Te Pātika Whakaropua, yeah, apologies. And so there's a real, it's been noted by a number of parties that, we don't, there's not too much of a desire to create another group that sits alongside other groups, particularly when, water's a focus of groups, or biodiversity or catchment management. So we really want to prove value of these groups and then hopefully broaden scope over time. So the focus then has shifted onto how they might achieve that purpose. We've talked about zone implementation plans, but the groups have talked about how to identify priorities, what the local priorities for these groups to focus on and to support. And so using those zone implementation plans to identify priorities that deliver towards the CWMS, understand and align current council, Papatapu Runanga and community efforts that address local catchment priorities. And so it's been noted at a number of these hui and conversations outside of these hui that there's not necessarily always a good picture of how Environment Canterbury's work might align with some of the work undertaken by a territorial authority that relate to water, for instance. And so if there's an ability to actually kind of align some of their work or to kind of report on it at the same time, that will be really valued by the community. There's also thinking about those priorities, thinking about the existing work underway, identifying gaps and make some recommendations about how those might be filled. And then ultimately kind of track and report progress against these. The other key bit of information that's been coming through these hui and conversations with community is just how do we make more visible the work that we do at place to the community across councils within that community. And so we're exploring opportunities to do that. So how will these groups operate? And I know this is a key thing for you because meetings are starting to pop up in several of your diaries. So each group will look a little different, and that's been very deliberate from the Mayoral Forum to make sure that these reflect kind of local flavourings essentially, and they are looking a little bit different. However, we're expecting most of these groups to come together approximately quarterly. The groups will be supported by our facilitation team. So much as zone committees were supported by a facilitation team, we have this facilitation team supporting the zone committees, supporting the local leadership groups, sorry. Local regional councillors are supporting establishment, and that includes our Ngāi Tahu councillors, it includes the chair and the deputy. However, when we're close to getting these groups up and running, we will be seeking formal nominations from council to sit on these groups. And groups will likely be set up in 2 tranches, as some discussions have progressed more than others, and that was on the direction from the chair to get some kind of early runs on the board, essentially. And so we do have some progressing more than others, and I think that's why some of you have been more involved in these establishment hui than others. And I particularly think from a Christchurch perspective and ihutai, we haven't had any sessions around ihutai, which is the kind of hydrological catchment around the estuary largely. And so when that gets up and running, we will be kind of broadening, and some will see invites in their diaries. However, if we think about Kaikoura, if we think about the Hurunui, Ashburton, Hakatiri, and Waitaki, we've had several meetings in those places now, and they've been going really well, and so they might be the first tranche.
Good old Ashburton. Didn't think I'd say that. Sorry, Ian.
we do need to note that this work is progressing in the midst of significant change, which you are very, very, very aware about. So central government reforms will represent a major shift for how freshwater and natural resources are managed, and it will impact on the CWMS. And so one of the key things that we're looking through at the moment is what might those impacts look like, so we can actually start providing advice on that. Zone committees were brought together to get those key people and parties around a table and to provide strong local voices in regional freshwater management. Through the establishment hui to date, we've heard that that's still important. And so that's why the local leadership groups provide that opportunity to keep that voice being heard. However, we do know that there's change coming, so the need for agility has also been expressed, and the groups will need to evolve as government changes progress. So we're not looking to lock in something here for 10 years. The Mayoral Forum has been very clear on putting these local leadership groups together and then assess as we go once some of that change is better understood.
I've got a question from Councillor Mackenzie and then Councillor Faulkner.
Well, more a comment than anything else, Cam. But my discussions with Selwyn Mayor Lydia and Ashburton Mayor Liz is that the conversations have moved on locally quite a lot. They've agreed on the mayors have agreed on the existing boundaries rather than any reform boundaries. Waimak, Selwyn, Ashburton, and South Canterbury. And secondly, they're now thinking that the purpose of the committees is about bringing together people who can help the district councils in the transition to taking over regional council functions, which is slightly different to the discussion we had when the Ashburton and Selwyn we met in Ashburton that time. It's sort of progressed because of the government's agenda, I think. Have you got some comments about that?
On the first point with regard to those boundaries, absolutely, and particularly the southern boundary with Rangitata and the district council and the regional councillors at the time, along with the Arwhenua Chair, we're all comfortable with that. The approach to the Rakai still just hasn't been tested with Taumutu, but absolutely at the last Ashburton meeting, those in attendance were absolutely proposing that the Rakai be the boundary much as it is for the water zone. I can't comment on the second part. I haven't been part of those conversations, but it will be interesting to see if that comes out at the next Ashburton hui.
Just further to that, I think, and it was on the slide around the the original purpose for the local leadership groups certainly is local solutions to local problems, and originally they were, based off, and will continue the work on zone committees and the CWMS, but we've already noted that actually it's a key mechanism or asset for bringing the local voice into the local government dialogue. And I think one of the points that Cam had put on there was about, the changing context from central government and the simplification of local government. Those decisions haven't been made yet, so I think there'll be more clarity as we go forward. We've got, there's obviously legislative implications, but we're keeping that open. And the key thing is that it is a forum for, the local voice and local partners. So, I'm not disagreeing or agreeing. I'm just saying that actually, that is the purpose, and these are the current things that we have on the agenda, and being open to the things that may come up.
Sorry, just sorting something out. Can I please get Andrea Davis? I'm actually going to... Jan, can you take over the rest of the session? Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So we had a meeting on Monday. It was the Banks Peninsula Local Leadership Group. And in there, it became clear to me that it's a governance group, you see, because I think where people are confused is the water zone committees were kind of half governance, half implementation, and it was the implementation part that maybe that's not the best way to govern water, so, or this type of water. So, yeah, I think we need to be clear that this group is a governance group, and we talked about feeding other smaller groups in as you need them. The makeup of it, you could have it very diverse and very hybrid, but it's a main group that is at a high level.
Yes, and through you, Chair. Yes, exactly. And we're seeing it look slightly different across the regions. Absolutely a focus on them being set at that governance level. And so the establishment kind of hui have been very much focused on that. And they've all been discussing the different ways in which they might, how that community interface looks like. Some are talking about having community representatives on that sit around that local leadership group. Others have said they've got such a vast community with different interest groups that they'll have a real focus on connecting in as a group with the community on a regular basis. And so that's some of the kind of local flavouring that we're starting to see.
John Faulkner.
Thanks, Cam. I'm really pleased to see the zone implementation plans included in there because I'm an advocate of the information and community cohesion that was included in them. But I do have a concern that they are fairly old. Our one would probably be 15, 16 years old. And there are some differences there. So just how they're going to be utilised by the leadership teams, is there going to be a guardrails around stopping rehashing old issues and going into trying to redo a plan?
Through you, Chair. Yes, so there's absolutely a lot of information, some of it older, that we're using to essentially bring together advice that we'll take to these local leadership groups, and how they use that information will be up to the groups. However, and it starts talking to the next slide, we have the CWMS has 2030 and 2040 targets. And so we really want to think about how we can use these groups to focus on what's the shift needed to, or what's the work needed to support that delivers towards 2030 and 2040 targets. And so try and have that kind of that future-focused conversation.
Kia ora, Kim. Sarah Gerard.
Thank you. Just back to the integrated catchment management and how important our rivers are. And two questions I have is the boundaries. Is it still the Waimakariri, Rakaia, and Rangatata as boundaries? That's my first question.
And through you, Chair. Yes, at the moment. So when the Mayoral Forum first made recommendations, it was both based on hydrological catchments, but that hasn't always been the kind of desired approach from some districts in particular. And so we are seeing a shift in some areas back to those rivers kind of being the border. However, at each of those groups, when they've talked about shifting back essentially to that, the approach that was used formerly, it's been discussed how some of these key alpine rivers weren't necessarily addressed as well as they could have through zone committees. And so how do you use these local leadership groups, and they might decide to have come together with their next door neighbours and have a focus on those big rivers, once or twice a year, so they're not lost. So lines on a map for the scope of these local leadership groups is one thing, but I think we can devise some work programs so we're not losing kind of integrated catchment management approach for those big rivers.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is, I'm really passionate about all our rivers in Canterbury, and as a councillor for Christchurch West, I haven't got much to do. So I'm just wondering how do I get involved with this? It's sort of like, this is why I stood for regional council, and yet I don't seem to have much of a role. And these leadership meetings are underway, and I don't know hardly anything about it, and I feel quite let down.
All right, Sarah, there's probably more conversation with Dion and myself to you and discuss further. Probably no Cam, we shouldn't answer that one. Ashley.
Thank you.
Good question, though.
My question is about, so these are local leadership groups and they're deciding local implementation of Canterbury Water Management Strategy and national policy. Where is the room within those groups for an expert voice? So not supplanting the local voice, but in addition to the local voice. And rather than just being an advisor, but part of the decision making. Because I feel that, to me, a lot of these issues, while local, are also regional and national. And to me, it feels like there should be some sort of expert voice within those groups, as well as the local input.
Through you, Chair. So this approach decided on by the Mayoral Forum firmly saw these as advisory governance groups, and I'll just unpack that a little bit, because it's around how do these groups kind of understand what those local priorities might be, particularly from a CWMS perspective. How do they support lots of the good work already occurring within those districts and within those local leadership group areas that are delivering towards those targets, but also doing a job of thinking about how they might kind of align across councils, and provide advice back into councils if they see additional kind of work required. So that's just one around the kind of advisory kind of nature of these groups. The other point around experts, there's certainly nothing preventing these groups having discussions with experts in the room on particular issues, much as with key kind of industry groups or it's been noted, how do you open up a conversation with a DOC or a LINS for some of these areas where they're such a big kind of player when it comes to integrated catchment management. So there's nothing preventing these groups pulling those people in.
And I would also add that fortunately, New Zealand being the country that it is, we have a lot of locally based experts as well. So it's not mutually exclusive.
Cam, you mentioned before about CWMS. These groups help implementing the CWMS. And you talked about the 2030, 2040 targets, and the Land and Water Regional Plan, etc. I know we had that discussion on Monday at the Te Pātaka, Banks Peninsula, Whakaropo, Little Harbour group, and just kind of strategy moving forward. And I know Megan was quite strong on this, and then probably how that fits in with the work that we've done on the RPS, I suppose, and then also kind of thinking what's happening into the future. And I know we're having a strategy day. Forget me right, Megan, is that next week? Yeah. And I don't know if some of that is transferred into some of that, Amy. I'm not too sure, but I mean, it's just probably how we kind of fuse those together a little bit, and helping set those, looking at those 30s and 40s targets, and what's been done, and how we can bring work into it. Anything on that?
Through you, Chair. So that's a really good question, because there are a number of strands and bits of work that have been produced over the last 2 years, but also that we need to produce over the next year, essentially, or particularly from a CWMS kind of targets and goals perspective. And just thinking about what was said at the Banks Peninsula Te Pātaka hui, and particularly from Councillor Mackay, was how do we kind of use these groups to really kind of think about what those 2030 and 2040 targets kind of mean at place, and what are the key priorities that group wants to focus on to deliver towards those. But I know we also heard from Runanga Chair to talk about and how do you not lose all that good work that was produced as part of RPS development, draft RPS development. So we haven't necessarily knitted it all together yet, but I expect that will be some of that information that really supports the work of these groups moving forward.
All right. I see, Sarah, you have another question?
Yes, we know that the main source of funding is through the river rating meetings that, they address the funding side of what happens on these rivers. So I'm just wondering how the relationship will be with the leadership group and the river rating meetings. How would that work?
Through you, Chair. That's a really good question. That's also come up and it came up in Ashburton in particular, because so we have local leadership groups, and there's a lot of work on the CWMS, obviously. We also have river rating districts, and a number of district councils have kind of drainage groups, etc. So I think that really comes down to there's obviously a need for increased understanding across councils while these work is delivering to, and I think that's some of that kind of alignment piece. There's not a formal kind of link with these groups and river rating districts yet, but that's something that we've talked about as a team about how do we, at the very least, kind of align work programs, and then see how this progresses through all that change coming at us.
Any other questions?
Thanks.
No? Oh.
I guess I'm just a bit disturbed with the nature of the conversation, and that it seems to be several councillors around this table think it's up to us to tell the district councils what these new leadership committees look like. I'm not convinced we've got it quite the right way round, given current government direction.
Well, I mean, Ian, I haven't been to the Ashburton one, but I mean the other ones I've been to, it's quite a collaborative process. I think the ones we've had with Kaikoura and Huranui, and it's there's no someone telling someone how it's going to look. It's actually kind of working out what's the best for that region. You know, talking to Craig Mackle, he just wants to keep the CWMS as it is, but you know we're not. So, and Mari, we had a couple of who did we have there, Claire? Sorry, at the Huranui, who did we have from the community? What was? Yeah, from catchment group. So I mean, it's Ian, it's quite open and transparent at the moment. Kia ora.
On that, so Banks Peninsula, there's 4 Runanga. So that group looks really different, but they're bespoke, aren't they? I feel as though they're bespoke groups.
Yep. Kapai. If there's nothing else, well, that's our last mahi for the day. Thank you, Cam. Thank you, team, for coming today at short notice. I know we had to fill that gap because we had a few questions, so thank you for being able to put this presentation together and then inform us councillors. So on that note, I think that's us for the day. I think Dion opened. So I'll close, and then if is anything on tomorrow? Oh, I can't remember. Anyway, otherwise next week.
Christchurch Partnership.
Oh yeah, Christchurch Partnership tomorrow. So best of luck, Nettles. Go hard. On that note, ka karakia whakakapi I tēnei wā. Kia tau ka minaki taka ka mea karo ki ruku ki tēnā ki tēnā o tātou. Ko mahi tuhu ma kiki, toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te reo, toi tū te aroha, tūturu whiti whakamaua ki a tīna. Hau mi hui e, tāi ki.